swipe left. Left is the good way, right? Left is matching.
I'm the wrong person to ask that question.
I know this. Swipe right.
Left is bad, right is good.
Okay, cool. I'll do that again. Welcome to In Bits, the podcast that deconstructs our digital lives. I'm Nicola.
And I'm Liam.
And we are both lecturers in cyberpsychology and applied psychology in IADT.
Yeah. So, Nicola, what are you in bits about this week?
This week, I am in bits about online dating. So I have a bit of a problem. I like to talk, and I apparently like to talk a lot about online dating. So our one episode has turned into 2 episodes. So we are going to be talking in the first episode about who's dating and why they're dating. And then the second episode, we're going to talk about the most common question I get about online dating, which is, why do so many men send so many dick pics?
Okay. Spoilers.
Yeah. And we're also going to talk more about like harassment and negative experiences in the second episode. So we're saving all of the lovely, delightful, horrible behavior for the second episode. The first one will have a little bit in it, but it's more general about what we're doing in online dating. So content warning, we will be talking about harassment. We'll be talking about unsolicited graphic images, so some sexual harassment, stuff like that. So if that is something that might be uncomfortable for you, please feel free to skip this episode. Okay, so do you think online dating is dying out?
No.
Okay.
No.
The headlines would have you believe otherwise. Surprise, cyberpsychology headlines not being accurate. Lots of headlines came out in August 2024, roughly around then, May as well, talking about how revenue was down on Match and Bumble and so on. Match.com is pretty much the biggest online dating kind of conglomerate. So they have Match and Hinge and a few other sites. And then you've got, obviously, Tinder and OkCupid and various other sites.
But are those numbers down because it's post-COVID and people are now moving away from online dating as much? Like, we're spending less time online? Is it that's what's impacting it? We're just seeing a drop in numbers down to normal? Or is it we're actually moving away from apps?
No, it's not even that. The numbers are up.
Okay, the numbers are actually up, but they're reporting them as down.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the numbers on Tinder are down, but the numbers on Hinge and Bumble and others have gone up. So there's just been a shift towards more diversity of dating apps, basically. The numbers on Grindr and Her, which are the gay and the lesbian site, are pretty stable. Yeah. And the numbers overall for online dating have actually gone up.
Okay.
But as we know, with companies, if they are not growing exponentially, then their growth is down. And so they posted some kind of not great earnings for a number of quarters in a row. And so everybody freaked out for a minute. But actually, people are still online dating. Like, it's been growing so much and the market changed so much when the apps came along. So around 2012 to 14 is where they started just taking off. Before that, it was mostly people who were in their 30s and older. So 30 to 45 was the kind of main age group for online daters before the apps came along. And that was a pretty solid market. And then the apps came along and they blew it up. And 18 to 29-year-olds became the biggest group of online daters. They never really dated before because they typically had access to a lot of single people. And so they didn't really need to. And the people who dated were people who didn't have access to other single people. So they were doing it because it opened up a wider dating pool. Whereas now it's just the place that you meet. Like, we know that 79% of 18 to 29-year-olds in the US have used Tinder. Like, that's 4 out of 5 adults, young adults have used Tinder.
I don't think that's surprising at all.
No, it's not. And then Bumble and Hinge are the next most popular. So Tinder's still the most popular. Online dating, like I said, been growing exponentially. It's now the primary way that people meet, by far the primary way that people meet. The next most popular way is bars and restaurants, which is also up a bit on what it used to be. And then friends, which is down quite a bit. Every other method of meeting is down on what it used to be. So meeting through family, friends, work, unsurprisingly, given the Me Too movement, like meeting at the workplace, not always the best way to meet these days. So this is the standard, most mainstream way to meet. That does not mean that people enjoy it or like it.
Well, it's convenient.
It is. Well, it can be.
Oh, yeah, it absolutely can be. So I've met my husband on online dating, so we'll get into that when it's appropriate. But your story of the timeline was me. So like I started going on to online dating apps in 2008, and the dumpster fire that it is sometimes, and then the actual convenience of it. I have lots of like stories of you did like sit down in an evening with your friends and you would talk about the profiles that you're seeing, or like people using Tinder in terms of like you'd sit down and have a chat with your group of friends and they'd be on Tinder as a social kind of activity with each other and be talking about it. I know there are other like Facebook groups that are particularly relevant in this space. I don't know whether you're going to focus on that or not.
Not so much this time, but we may come back to that because there's research starting to come out in some of those.
Okay, definitely. Like, I think we find an entertainment aspect to it. There's obviously the gamification aspect to online dating as well. To be honest, like in terms of time, convenience, like absolutely, like who has time to go to an in-person dating thing or event? That's not me. That's definitely not me.
Yeah, although a lot of people are trying those out again now, but there's a limited number of people at them, and it depends where you live. Like some places, there's a limited number of people. So once you hit 30, only about 20% of people are still single. And then if you live somewhere like more rural, that's not that many people. So it can be really hard to meet new people. And then, you know, obviously in the queer community, that's a smaller percentage of the population, plus people are matched up once they're older, and that leaves even fewer people. So like we know that the queer community are huge users of online dating. It works really well for them. They're also huge users of just creating community online, full stop.
Yeah.
So that makes sense. But they've been like early adopters of online dating for a long time.
Oh, yeah.
But it's starting to even up because it's just so mainstream now. It really is. So I tried online dating as well. That was how I got interested in this. This is my research area. I absolutely love it. I find it fascinating. I'm just very glad that I'm researching it and not doing it at the moment.
Yeah.
But I started online dating probably around 2008 as well.
Okay, same.
And I was using the traditional sites because obviously Tinder didn't launch till 2012. So I was using like The Guardian Soulmates, and the Irish Times had a dating site that was actually another dating site kind of tacked on to the Irish Times. But I kind of thought like, I'll meet people kind of like me who are interested in social issues and current affairs and stuff. I did not meet my husband through the dating sites. I gave up on them and quit them and then met him a couple of weeks later.
Okay.
But it was interesting.
Like if we go back to that time period, so like for the LGBT community, like, or for us, it was like Grindr was the only one, or it was the predominant one for like relationships rather than just purely hookups. The Plenty of Fish and Match, they were the ones that kind of I remember.
Yeah.
And they all had their own like niche element that you could have. Like I think geolocation was the kind of one for Grindr really that then exploded for everything else. It was a dynamic space.
It was. It was not as much of a dumpster fire back then, I think, as it is now.
Really?
Well, in my experience, but maybe my experience was different.
I think in college, it was certainly, no, it was still very similar and reminiscent of what it's like now. Really? I don't think a lot of people were looking for it. I suppose it depends on what people were actually looking for or seeking.
Yeah.
When I was in college, I met no significant other or partner, anyone on those apps.
Okay.
I actually, through the traditional methods of clubs and societies in college, friends of friends.
I thought you were going to say bars, clubs and bars.
no, clubs and socks. Not that cool. Nights out with those clubs and socks, and then referrals of friends, so like trusted people you would know, and then everyone would have discussions about the apps and like how no one was being successful on them. And I think maybe it was just we didn't know how to use them properly. We didn't have the same skills. We were still kind of like fish out of water and trying to learn how to use those spaces. Like we have to remember that like other traditional apps, like social media apps like Facebook, was only really, you could only like write on someone's wall or timeline in like 2006.
Yeah.
So we then jumped into online dating. So it's not like we were exactly like early adopters of technology.
Yeah.
We were just, here's an app, go figure out how it works as well.
Yeah, I think now I'm going to show my age. I'm a little older, slightly, a couple of years older than you.
Yeah.
So I was in my 30s when I was using dating apps in 2008, and you were not.
I was 19.
It was probably explains
18,
a fair bit in the difference in our experiences. So yeah, mine was the the traditional hit 30, no one's single. I'd come back from America. So you kind of, when you move away for a few years, you lose your acquaintances, which means you've less intros to people and all that kind of stuff. And like you always get some good, interesting stories out of online dating, even if you don't meet somebody. So I got sent 2 stories when I asked people about their experiences of online dating, at least one that's really positive and one that's very funny. So I thought I'd share those. One is a friend of mine who met up for coffee with someone that they met online, ended up staying in the cafe for 6 hours, and now that date is their anniversary.
They have no chance of getting a mortgage with all that coffee they've just drunk.
They just bought a house.
Oh, really? Okay.
Living the dream.
Yeah.
And the bad one was really funny. So this person met a farmer who claimed to have his previous Tinder date in the boot of his car and asked if she wanted to see her.
Oh, God. Run.
Yeah. Joking about murdering previous dates on a first date, guys, not a great strategy. After that, once the joke had died on its feet, he spent the rest of the date discussing the bacterial content in his cow's milk.
Okay.
There was no second date.
Okay. Okay. Right.
Yeah. I'm going to share one or two of my own.
That's probably nerves, though.
I get it.
That's nerves and nothing to talk about. No common interest, so he just fell back on the most comfortable conversation he had, which was bacteria in his cow's milk. I don't know. I'm trying to give the man a...
You are definitely giving him a lot of leeway there. So my own, I had a number of funny experiences. You do really just come away with funny stories from online dating if you don't meet somebody. And like I said, I didn't meet my husband in online dating, but I had a couple of funny ones. So there was a guy that I met that walked really fast. I used to wear heels. I do not anymore. But I used to wear heels to go on dates. And he fucking took off, like walking really, really fast. Anyway, we got to the restaurant. I was sweating, went into the bathroom, and when I closed the bathroom door, the cubicle door, the lock fell off it and went flying out into the middle of the bathroom where I could not reach it. And I spent I felt like 20 minutes. It probably was more like 15, but it felt like 20 minutes trying to figure out how to get out of there. So I was shouting for help at a certain point because I figured I couldn't get the door open. Okay. I think I eventually jimmied it with like a hair clip or something. I can't remember exactly how I got out, but I did eventually get out. And I went outside and it was like he didn't even notice that anything was wrong. I was gone for so long and he didn't even notice. I was like, I just got locked in the bathroom. He's like, all right.
He's probably just being polite. Like not commenting on the amount of time you were in the toilet.
Yeah, it was really weird. Okay. I also had a guy show up that looked like he was about to go on like some sort of mountaineering expedition in like hiking boots and combat pants and stuff. And he had hatfished me. Have you heard of hatfishing before?
No.
So catfishing is obviously when you make up a completely different identity. Hatfishing is where you cover up your balding head. So being bald, totally fine. I have no problem with being somebody being bald. I do have a problem with them covering it up in the photos that they sent.
Oh.
So this guy was not the height that he said he was. I was wearing heels and I was a good 4 inches taller than him. And he was balding, which he was not in the photos because you couldn't see. And he was also just a little strange. He told me he's going to take me to Paris on the first date. I was like, yeah, you're grand.
It's kind of like close to a love bomb, but also just, there's too many lies in that. It's kind of like when someone posts a photograph of themselves and a series of other people and you have to like, where's Waldo, who the person actually is in it.
Right?
But
catfishing.
I love that.
I love it. I did not know that term at the top.
I absolutely love that.
But I loved it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I absolutely love that.
Online dating can be a bit of a dumpster fire. So when you talk to people who are trying online dating, like people can be positive. Lots of people meet their partners. If this didn't work at all, nobody would be using it, right? It does work. It's also pretty much the number one way that people meet a long-term partner now. So it does work. So for any of you out there listening to this who are trying it at the moment and feeling a bit despairing of it, like it can work. Primarily, it's about numbers. It's about getting you to meet more people so that you meet someone that you like. That's really all it is. I
think it's about being selective, though. It is about not just going, oh, hey, there's this massive pool of people and it's just numbers, because otherwise you have no criteria. The more specific or the more particular, or I don't want to say demanding, but like the higher your standards are, doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to meet anyone. Like those standards are also important.
But the process of online dating changes your standards and not necessarily in a positive way.
Okay.
We're going off script now.
Sorry, apologies.
You're spoiler alerting.
Okay.
I'll come back to that because it is interesting.
Just censor me.
Yeah. So, okay, let's get into this here. I was going to cover it later, but let's talk about it here. So The way that humans best make decisions and choices is when we have a limited number of choices to actually choose from. So like 6 to 8 choices appears to be the optimum from the research.
6 to 8 choices of date?
No, 6 to 8 choices of anything. If you're choosing jams, you want 6 to 8 choices. You don't want 50 choices, right? We make better decisions with fewer choices.
I don't want even 6.
Fair enough.
Yeah. No,
I just want the one I like.
Yeah.
What happens is when you have loads of choices, you have so many things to consider. So you've got different attributes of each particular choice. So there's like pros and cons to each one. And you start getting more concerned about the attributes you're leaving behind when you make this particular choice. So we tend to be less satisfied with the decisions that we make. We have more regret about what we left behind. So then when you apply this to online dating and you think about the hundreds of choices that you have every single time you go in, that's where it starts to get problematic. It's not really great for actually making good decisions. On top of that, the research suggests that when you're swiping, when you get to a certain point, you start off and you're swiping right in a few people and you're like, oh, that person looks interesting. That person looks interesting. The further in you go, in around 20 or 30 swipes, you start to get pickier and pickier and pickier because you think, well, I really liked that bit of that person and that bit of that person and that person's job. And that guy was kind of tall. He was cool. And that was nice about that person. And you're thinking the perfect one who has all of these great bits will come along soon.
Okay, so you're delusional.
So you're delusional.
Sorry.
Yeah. Online dating makes us delusional.
Okay.
But you keep thinking that like perfect person will come along. And so you stop swiping right in people. So it's actually not very good for actually making decisions.
Yeah, no. I think if you were continuously swiping, God, left or right, whichever way, if you're looking for that perfect profile, I think you kind of have to be a bit realistic and know that that perfect profile doesn't really exist.
Yeah, but the dating site is set up to make you not think that way, unfortunately.
It's the gamified aspect too, isn't it?
Yeah. So even when people go in with realistic expectations, it changes the way they think. They get a sort of shopping mentality. They start to commodify other people, which they don't like. But they also commodify themselves, which they don't like either. Like there's a lot about it that feels not very human in some ways, and kind of transactional in some ways.
It is transactional. It is.
It is. It doesn't have to be a bad thing, but it can be. So, what are people getting out of it and why are they doing it? There are so many motivations for dating online. So obviously, when you think about it, everybody thinks about relationships and sex. Like they're the two things that everybody thinks everybody's online dating for. But there's a lot of other reasons. So the main one is, traditionally anyway, has been that people didn't have access to a lot of other people. And so online dating basically expands your dating pool and the available people. That is a bit less of the main reason now because so many different kinds of people are dating online. So like when you get into your 30s, not as many people are single. Only about 20% of people are single. And so your dating pool is greatly reduced. And so traditionally people would have started online dating to increase that dating pool. But now like 18-year-olds are using it and they have quite a wide dating pool. Like they're in college or they're working and they're meeting lots of new people. So that's not really as much of it anymore. People are looking for someone who's similar to themselves in terms of like their values, their attitudes, their interests, that kind of thing. That's very, very similar to offline as well. But there's a lot of reasons for dating online, more than you'd expect. So when researchers ask people, what are you getting out of this? Relationships and sex, obviously, are the top ones, but friendship is really common. So it's not necessarily that people are always going in looking for friends, although they sometimes are. But they often make friends along the way. So often you'll meet someone and you'll like them, but there isn't an attraction there. So there's a social attractiveness, but not a romantic attractiveness.
I know so many people who have made friends through online dating.
Yeah.
Where they go on a first date and it's just flat, but they actually end up being friends. Like I know people who have like moved in with mates and stuff.
Yeah.
Completely common.
See, that's brilliant. Yeah. And that's actually really common, particularly in the LGBTQ plus community. Community and belonging is also a reason, again, in that community for using online dating. So if you are not out, or if you are newly out, or you don't have a community around you, maybe you've moved somewhere where you don't know many people, it's a really good way to meet people. And people are generous. They help each other out. They introduce you to more people within the community. And it actually creates a sense of belonging. So it's really useful for a lot of people for that. People also use it for entertainment, to alleviate boredom because it's fun. They'll do it with friends sometimes. They'll do it a little bit of peer pressure. Everybody's doing it. They feel like they have to as well. Out of curiosity, like what's in there, what's going on. Also, though, ease of communication. So we have this idea that there is the true self, the true version of us that exists psychologically, but isn't always expressed in the real world. And some people find it much easier to express that true self online. They might be more shy, more socially anxious, and so they just find it easier to talk to other people and be themselves online. And for people like that, they find it easier to date online because you're starting the relationship online and they're good at that. And then they can bring it offline more easily. They feel more at ease doing that. So that's really useful for some people.
But that's the type of person who potentially just chats a lot in an online dating profile and never potentially even meets someone.
Possibly, yeah.
That's what comes to mind when I think of that type of person.
Yeah. And actually that ties into a couple of the other motivations as well. So one of them, self-validation and exploration of identity are kind of tied, but also a little different. Self-validation might be that you're just out of a long-term relationship and you're like, I wonder, does anybody even find me attractive? Like, if I put myself out there, what's going to happen? And so you might join a dating site and get some matches and feel good about yourself. Or if your self-esteem is low, you're just not feeling great about yourself, you might put yourself out there to see if you get some matches, and it gives you a little bit of ego boost. But exploration of identity is a little tied to that because it can be about validation of the self. And that's maybe exploring an aspect of yourself that you're not able to offline. So that might be members, again, of the LGBTQAI plus community. So like trans people exploring their gender identity, or queer people coming out in online dating, but maybe not outside of that because they're not able to. And getting feedback from other people that they're attracted to them is very validating of their self.
And that's not just like physical validation. That's your personality, how you engage with people, your sense of humor, the stuff that you find. It's not as easy to change as changing, like dyeing your hair or changing a physical characteristic of yourself. So like from a self-esteem perspective, I get that.
Yeah. They're like fully able to express who they really are. So I think it's really, really interesting the way it can be useful for that. Some people are using it to distract themselves from like an ex, to stop thinking about the ex and try and focus on things moving forward.
Not really that healthy a behaviour, but okay.
No, it's helping them move forward. So
sure.
Could be good, could be bad. Depends.
Yeah.
Yeah, it depends how people are using it.
I would steer a friend away from doing that.
You probably want to resolve some stuff before you try find somebody else. But yeah.
That's exactly what I mean.
And then people use it when they're traveling, just to meet people, kind of like they're looking for people to go clubbing with or to see a place with, get introduced to different areas. And so they'll do it through online dating quite successfully as well. So there's a lot that people are getting from it, although I talk a lot about the negatives, and the next episode's just going to be all negative. There are really beneficial, positive things that come from it as well. So how successful is it? Most people do go on at least one date. I think it's about this. So the American study from the Pew Research Institute looks at this every few years, and their most recent study from 2023 found that about 77% of people go on at least one date. So it is American data, but it's quite similar to other weird countries like Western industrialized countries. We may be slightly behind them, but not that much. But about 40% of Americans have entered into a long-term relationship or marriage through online dating, which is quite incredible. It's higher again for LGB people. I say LGB because this particular piece of research from Pew doesn't look at any other members of the community. I'm not just leaving them out. It's because they didn't look at them. In terms of long-term outcomes, there's one study. There were a few studies from about 10 years ago, 11 years ago. But that was before really Tinder or anything took off, and the data was completely pre-Tinder. So I don't know how relevant it is anymore, but there's a more recent study looking at long-term outcomes. And again, it's in the US. And they found that the relationships, the marriages in particular, that were created from online dating were a bit less satisfying and a bit less stable than those formed by offline daters. However, it wasn't necessarily the fact that they met online. It's that when you meet online, you sometimes meet different kinds of people. And that puts external pressures on your marriage. So there's greater interracial marriage through online dating. It's one of the things that's increasing interracial marriage in the US. And people are also more likely to be from different geographic areas. So they might have been in long distance relationships for a while and then moved together. That means their social support networks aren't always around them. And so the fact that they're interracial marriages, they might experience more marginalization in society. And then they have more geographic distance and pressures because they don't have people around them. And so it's likely that that is what is explaining the less stable marriages than the fact that they actually meet online itself. We don't have a lot of data from other countries, and we particularly don't have a whole lot of recent data from other countries. So it's something that we still don't know, and lots of research still needs to be done on that.
I'm listening to it and I'm like, 40% have entered a long-term relationship or marriage through online dating, and then you move into the doomsday that these are potentially less satisfying or stable marriages or relationships. And I'm like, okay, great. And then you break it down and it's like, it's actually the social support structure.
Yes.
It's actually not necessarily really that we can stand over it.
Yes.
There's a whole lot more happening in the background.
Exactly.
So if you have entered into a relationship or a marriage through online dating, ignore the fact that you potentially are going to have a negative experience as a result of that.
Yeah, you absolutely may not. And bear in mind that is American data, and they are very racist. So if you're in a different country, it might be less racist. And so interracial marriages might not be so problematic, and you might not have the marginalization that you have elsewhere. You might do, like racism is everywhere, but, and geographical distribution is also different in different countries as well. So that may not be such an issue for some people.
Okay, yeah.
One of the things that people find very, very frustrating about online dating is that it's really hard to communicate who you are to others through dating profiles and messages. So it's a very shallow kind of platform. And we are complex human beings with nuance and layers and so on. We are like Shrek. And communicating that in a very limited way, like, when you look at Tinder, it's got a 500 character limit on your bio. And most people don't write that much. It's very difficult. And then on the flip side of that, seeing what somebody's like and determining what somebody's like from that profile and from their initial messages is also really difficult. And so a lot of first dates just aren't successful, partly because you just don't have chemistry with the person and so on, but partly because it's really difficult to get a sense of the experiential qualities of a person from their profiles and so on. We're not very good at it. That was what my PhD research was on. Like, can we tell what somebody's personality traits are like from their dating profiles? And it was pretty much a resounding no from my research. So we can't tell how warm somebody is, how spontaneous, how fun, again, whether we have any chemistry with them and so on. So a lot of the times people go on first dates and the person just isn't right for them. Now, sometimes it can still be fine. It can be friendly and nice. But other times they feel like the person has maybe misrepresented themselves. And that can be true because people do lie in online dating, mostly about small stuff, mostly about stuff that isn't going to have a huge impact on the first date. Because the purpose of online dating is to meet somebody, and if you've said you're 6'4" and you're 5'4", it's going to kind of be immediately obvious. It's not a great way to get started. So
people, that's a typo.
Yeah, people tend to exaggerate, but like within the realms of reasonable plausibility, kind of. And sometimes, obviously, they completely lie and catfish. We'll get back to that. Sometimes people think they've been lied to. This person isn't who I thought they were going to be. And sometimes that comes down to a misinterpretation. So with computer-mediated communication, when we're communicating through technology, and particularly text-based communication, we're missing all of the nonverbal cues. You miss facial expressions, you miss tone of voice, pitch of voice, all the things that give context and meaning to the words that you're saying, and emphasis, and so on. And so when you're missing those, you use the bits of information that you have available to you, all the little cues that you have available. So their spelling, their grammar, the way they use punctuation, the GIFs, the emojis, even the length of the message they send or the timing of the messages they send. And that all communicates information. And you don't know the person, but if you're communicating with them back and forth, you've obviously liked something about their profile picture. So there might be a halo effect, which means you're kind of looking at everything through rose-tinted glasses. Your initial positive impression follows through into everything else, and you view it a bit more positively.
In the dating world, that's, do they have a dog in their profile picture?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Cat.
Yeah, no, dog.
So what happens is you start to fill in the gaps of your knowledge with the bits of information you have and extrapolate, because we like to make meaning from the bits of information we have. We don't like to be left without meaning. And we fill in those gaps with quite positive information. We're trying to create a picture of them. We already think they're nice, so we create a positive image. And that can lead us to believe they are a particular way. Now, if you go on talking for ages, like in lockdowns, without meeting the person, that can mean you start to create this very idealized image of the person. It becomes fantastical. And then no matter who shows up on the date, they're so far away from the person you've created in your head that that's going to be disappointing.
Never gonna be successful, yeah.
So you want to meet somebody quite quickly. But even with that, you've got an impression of in your head of what they're like. And it's not necessarily how they are, because you've extrapolated and created this image of the person. And that's not necessarily accurate. It's not necessarily their fault, because no matter how much they try and control what they're writing in their profile and so on. They can't control how you interpret it. And so there's sometimes a mismatch between people who shows up and what you thought was going to show up. And sometimes that's really not deliberate. It's just like a mismatch of perception, I think. So there's that, which that's just feels more like kind of you're wasting your time sometimes. Like you're having all these dates, they're not successful, the person isn't who you thought they were, there's no chemistry, etc. So that can just get a bit tiring, I think.
No, but I think it's important to talk about how that halo effect may not also be false. So that person might have positive photographs. They might have photographs with family, friends. They might have photographs with pets. They might have photographs where they show their activities. They go hiking. They're enjoying it. And they're clearly trying to convey that side of their personality. And you may inflate or create this picture that they're caring, they're kind, they're active, they like pets. These are all the tick boxes. You're like, bingo, 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 great. If the halo effect or the picture that you create of that person might be accurate to a point, but if you allow yourself to wait too long to meet that person, like you've said, that might just begin to spiral and it'll go off the rails a little bit.
Yeah.
Like when I first started dating my now husband, we would chat on the apps, and what I actually paid attention to was sense of humor in terms of personality. Like I'd be chatting to other people, not really as much, and then I would always be like, I want to go and talk to this person because of their sense of humor. We kind of almost got into that halo effect aspect because I cancelled our first 5 dates. Yeah, I know. I'm not a good person. So like the fact that it actually made it to a first date was actually very interesting. But then the halo effect or the inflated aspect of their personality that I had paid attention to. So sense of humor was a massive thing. Like I was laughing so much. And then like we spent the entire time connecting about the other stuff that we had chatted about and kind of similar interests. So it wasn't too long before it was actually probably about 2 months.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So, but like I cancelled, but I kept coming back.
Yeah.
Because I was like, there's no other person who I actually wanted to interact with as well, which is a little bit romantic. So it's not, halo effect doesn't always necessarily have to be bad, I think.
No, it doesn't. Absolutely not. And the hyper-personal communication where you're talking for ages and you build up that idealized impression of the person doesn't always happen. It really depends how you're communicating. And sometimes it can be real. Like the main problem is that we think that more information about a person is going to lead to more liking. And most of the time it actually doesn't. Most of the time it confirms that the person isn't somebody we like, until it's a person where that information does confirm that we like them, which obviously happened in this case, which is very sweet.
Which is very nice, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's every single case.
Because it can even happen in long-term relationships. If a couple are in a long-term relationship and they mainly text rather than video chat, they can also build up that false impression of the other person. They forget what they're really like and they start to build really idealized impression of them. And when they meet in person, their relationship satisfaction goes down. So it's not just people you don't know. It can be people you know as well. It's really fascinating, which just goes to show that like statistics and averages are like across a population. This is what mostly happens, but there are always outliers in that.
Even like we did long distance as well at one point, and we communicated via like a shared server to watch films together because like nerd, like video chats, trying to keep like obviously I'm aware of all the concepts of like CMC and like more or less visual cues. Like you have to have a strong GIF game.
Yeah.
Like all of these things that keep your communication kind of fresh and interactive, they're all important in the early stages of dating as well. So it doesn't become this like monotonous back and forth of, hey, how are you?
Yeah.
Hey, how are you? Yeah, I'm fine. My day was fine too.
Yeah.
Because that's obviously just stale.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. It's a shallow form of getting to know somebody, and it's not always accurate, and people get very frustrated and not being able to get to know somebody. Some researchers have tried different ways of making it more social and interactive and more natural as a way to get to know each other. So they've tried stuff like gaming together, which is actually quite successful. A lot of people actually meet online through gaming. They've tried like walking around a virtual gallery together and chatting about the paintings on the wall, which actually increases social liking. Not necessarily romantic liking, because you don't know whether you're going to have chemistry with somebody, but it increases social liking, which means that the first date is more successful. Just generally, you're going to like the person more. So there was one really interesting piece of research by Zeitko and colleagues where they looked at trying to create better conversations between people, or kind of a prompted discussion interface to start conversations between people that might let them get to know each other better. And they specifically looked at this to help women make better assessments of whether they might like to meet somebody or not. So the aim was to create a couple of different options. So they had the open conversational option, which is like a normal dating site where you have to think of something to say and talk to the other person. And then they had 2 prompted discussion interfaces, which were based around first date scenarios. So they had a number of stories about first dates, and you had to indicate your agreement or disagreement with what was happening in those stories. And then you had either an interface where you were talking to somebody who had agreed with you about the story or who had disagreed with you about the story.
Okay.
And what they found was the prompted disagreement interface. First of all, women did not like it, right? Because sometimes guys get mad if you say they're wrong about something or you disagree with them. And so women had a lot of experiences in the past where men reacted very poorly to being disagreed with. They use this quote in the paper, and it really comes back to this, that men are afraid that women will laugh at them and women are afraid that men will kill them, by Margaret Atwood. So women didn't like this prompted disagreement variation. They preferred the prompted agreement variation. They thought that that would lead to much more interesting conversations because it gives you something to talk about.
But you also don't want to start off any form of romantic interaction by disagreeing with someone anyway. You're always going to come up against it with that.
Now, the men preferred it to women. They still prefer the agreement one more, but they prefer the disagreement ones because, and this is a quote from the survey, it could allow you to filter out the crazies. They could see how people disagreed and filter people out from that, which is quite interesting. The agreement interface did provoke better decisions for women, but not for men. Men liked the prompted agreement interface because it saved them having to think of a topic for conversation. So it sort of saved them time and energy for that. But they also felt that it gave them like a perceived advantage for self-presentation. So they basically interpreted it as having already agreed on the topic was emphasizing compatibility. So it was kind of like they'd already got a match. And so the prompt was seen as a way of helping men to showcase their compatibility and therefore their attractiveness, which is not what it was doing. Women saw it as a way to open up an interesting conversation and a more stimulating conversation, and it allowed them to make better decisions. So yeah, there was a little bit of a mishap with how it actually functioned. The motivations
are different, though. One is deceptive, or it can be perceived as deceptive, and like I'm gonna encourage a match. The other one is actually like information seeking in its motivation. They're very different.
They are. But it also comes down to a fundamental difference in how men and women perceive bits of information. Men and women pick up attraction cues differently. Men tend to overestimate how attracted women are to them, and women tend to seriously underestimate how attracted men are to them. So men will take you agreeing with them as indicating attraction. They will also take you being nice to them as attraction, hence them hitting on so many waitresses and servers and people working places where you have to be friendly to customers because they're like, oh, that person was nice to me, they must be attracted to me. Whereas women tend not to do that.
I don't really know what to say to that.
Yeah, I know. It's just the straights. the straights being straight.
I think the first one of like women just had to agree because they knew what men were going to be like in that sample. Like it's obviously going to be isolated to one small group of men, and we can't generalize that every single man is going to get angry if you don't agree with them, because that's not the case. But in these dating scenarios, the attractiveness cue of you agree with me, therefore you like me, therefore you physically are attracted to me is significant leaps to make in a short space of time.
A plus B equals Z.
It's problem.
Yeah. So it could be that you're misreading cues. It could be that it's just a really shallow form of getting to know somebody. So like it's not great for that. And we haven't really found scalable, better ways of doing it. So like I said, all the different bits of information are important. Things like message length, timing, all the bits of information that we give away accidentally rather than on purpose. So we know, like, for example, that a lot of first messages from men to women are extremely short. Like I think the median length in one study was 12 characters. 12 characters.
That's basically, hey, how are you?
Yeah, exactly. And like 25% of them were 6 characters or less. Whereas women's was like,
how are you?
Hey, exclamation mark. Women's were 122. That was the median. So they were writing quite a lot more. And women get a lot more messages than men. So they're going to answer the ones that have a bit more in them and have made a bit more of an effort.
But doesn't that concept for Bumble come from that kind of train of thought that like women make the first message and therefore the relationship is more likely to be, but not the relationship, the communication is more likely to be successful?
Yeah. And like the research, there is some research showing that if women initiate the conversation or the match, that it is more likely to be successful and that they're likelier to be happier with the match. It doesn't really make a difference for men. Seems to work equally either way. So I would say to women, like, go out and get what you want rather than waiting, for sure. So yeah, men and women have very different experiences then. So women tend to be quite picky in how they go through their matches. So they swipe right on very few. They only swipe right on the ones they actually like and would like to meet up with. Whereas men, and this is, of course, on average, there's always going to be people who do things differently. Men tend to swipe right on almost everybody and then decide when they match with people whether they would actually like to meet them or not, or kind of go forward. And so they don't get a lot of matches. Women get a lot more matches. Then men send more of the first messages, so women get a lot more messages, so they can be pickier about who they respond to, and they only respond to the best ones.
It just makes it sound like so much effort.
I know. This is why when you were like, it's convenient and effortless, and I'm like, no, it's not. I mean, it does work eventually for a lot of people, but it's not necessarily effortless.
I think it's not convenient for women, maybe. I think, like, obviously this kind of stuff doesn't apply into LGBT as
no, there's
as
different
perfectly,
things.
definitely.
Yeah, definitely. But like, men also have a terrible experience because of operating this way. So they send loads of messages and they match with loads of people or swipe on loads of people. They get very few messages. They get very few matches. And sometimes they get no messages, and it's like screaming into the void, and it can make them quite anxious and quite depressed and feel like nobody finds me attractive. But actually it's just that nobody's using the site in the way it should be used. And so it's not bringing back the kind of results that they're hoping to get. And then that sometimes results in men keeping sending messages to women after they said they're not interested, or sending a message and then another one and then another one, and then getting ruder and ruder and ruder when they don't get a response. Because they're like really frustrated and they're trying to just get something back from the void. Not an excuse for it. A little bit understandable in a way, but not an excuse for it.
It's very, persistent is the best way to describe that. Definitely,
Photos are so important for online dating, and people know this. It's the first stage of the filtering process. You are scrolling through, you're looking at people's photos before you see anything else about them. So if it's not good, you're just not going to swipe right on it. And they're also important because they have a halo effect. So it is really important to get a good photo. You would be amazed at the kinds of photos that people pick, though. There is a whole Tumblr dedicated to Tinder guys with tigers, where they are sitting with drugged tigers, because apparently that is super hot. The other thing that's important is what information you choose to give away. So you kind of have two strategies here. You can be quite vague, or you can be really, really specific. If you're quite vague, you might attract quite a lot of people, but they don't really know anything about you. You're quite generic. Whereas if you're very specific, there might be less people who get in touch, but they might be better matches for you. And when you're writing your bio, and it is so important to have a bio, especially if you're a guy, so women need more information before they're likely to meet somebody. Partly out of safety concerns, we would really like not to meet a serial killer, but partly because we want to know, like from an evolutionary psychology perspective, there's this idea that we want to know more about a partner because we're hoping they'll stick around and provide resources if we have children with them. It's kind of something built in the background. But basically, we want more information about them. So if you don't have a bio, if you don't have multiple photographs, that's kind of a red flag. But with the bio, the first thing people are doing is filtering for red flags, right? For their own personal red flags or own personal things that they dislike. Like I would be filtering for smoking, for example. Not a fan, wouldn't want to date somebody who was smoking. But other people are filtering for other red flags. There's some really obvious ones. Like in general, being negative in your dating profile, people don't really like. They filter out of that quite quickly, particularly listing a whole bunch of characteristics that you don't like about people generally doesn't set the stage in a good way. Doesn't create a great first impression. You can get into that later. So being positive is useful. And then everyone will have their own personal idiosyncratic red flags. Like if they've dated two guys called Dave before and they absolutely hated them, they were horrible people, and your name's Dave, that might be a red flag for them. They just make that association. They can't help it. What's important, though, in your bio is to give people give them something that they can talk about when they send you a first message. Now, Some people aren't going to read the bio. They're just going to message you and say, hey, anyway. But if you can, give them something interesting that they can talk about, that they can discuss with you. One thing we do know is that a lot of profiles are really cliched. I like long walks on the beach and like watching Netflix with a glass of wine on a Friday night. Like, who the hell doesn't? It's very hard to tell anything about the person from that. It will work in terms of like not turning anybody off unless they don't drink red wine and they don't drink at all, maybe. But, you know, it doesn't say anything about you. So there was some research that came out kind of recently that looked at what works better. And it turns out that having like concrete and specific examples and descriptive examples of what you're interested in and who you are is better. So rather than saying like, I'm a foodie or I love eating out, because like most people do, saying something like, I really love trying new foods with my friends, or the best thing about traveling is getting to try different cultures and new foods and to meet new people over that food. Like something that's much more specific than just, I like food.
That tells you so much more. It's like, I love to travel. This is why I love to travel.
Yeah.
You can see my incentive is not to just, I like to experience new cultures. That's not, I like to sit by a pool and read a book and not interact with the culture that I'm in.
Yeah.
So like that tells you a lot about their personality. It's not just, oh, I like Thai food.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. So being specific is good. Okay. So the Pew Internet Research Institute brings out fantastic research across lots of different areas to do with technology, people's attitudes, behaviors, etc. online. And every few years they bring out a really good report on online dating in America. And while the American market is a little different to other markets, the other weird countries, or like Western industrialized countries, are quite similar in their dating market. They're a little bit behind it. It's the most mature market, but we are very, very similar. We're rapidly catching up on them. So I think it's quite relevant. So they found that people in general are more positive than negative about online dating, but it's actually a very small difference. So 53% were positive versus 46% negative. Not that big a difference.
No, really small.
Yeah. 11% were very negative about online dating. And those range of experiences are quite broad about what's happening in there. There's big differences in who has better or worse experiences, as you can probably imagine. Men have better experiences than women. The LGBT community overall reported a better experience, but when you get into some of the numbers on harassment and negative experiences, they actually experienced more of those. So it could be that they are, maybe it's more successful for them in that they're meeting more people, but they're also having to put up with worse stuff in order to do that.
But that's also not the full like queer community though either.
No, it's so not. Yeah, it's so not. Okay. It's the Pew Internet Research reports are on the LGB part of the community, and not more than that, which is probably, I would say, down to numbers in terms of reporting. I'm not 100% sure why they choose to only do that. Yeah, but yeah, it's quite limited.
My assumption would be that particularly like even trans community, even within gay apps, like there was a lot of discussions within the queer community around like transphobia, particularly stating like racial preferences as well. There's a big movement. There's been some of that research. So I think it depends on where in these communities you look. Yeah.
We will come back and look at different communities and racism and things like that. That's going to be all in our second episode. We're saving all the lovely stuff for the second episode. I'm going to try and keep it light this week. Having said that, next thing I'm going to talk about is deception. Because, we're keeping it light. So we're going to talk about like more general deception. We're going to talk a bit about catfishing, because that is something that happens. It's been in the news a little bit recently. And variations on catfishing, like catfishing, like we talked about earlier. So deception is pretty common in online dating. Mostly small kinds of deception, because people are trying to find that balance between presenting themselves as they are, so that the person who shows up in the first date is themselves, and trying to create like a attractive person. But sometimes it does go a bit further, and people do catfish or versions of it. So catfishing is when somebody creates an entirely fictitious profile. It's an entirely different person to who they really are. Might be a different gender, might be different sexual orientation. Right. It could be anything at all. They often have a suite of characters to back it up. So they'll have friends or family that they've created as well. And they may not intend to hurt somebody, but they may get into relationships with people online that become very in-depth. The other person feels like they have this incredible relationship with them. But they're not talking to the person they think they're talking to. And that's very distressing. It's very hurtful. It can ruin people's sense of trust in others. And so it does cause harm even if the intention isn't there. Like building a relationship on a foundation of a really significant lie is problematic, definitely. And especially when it gets into something sexual, because then you have real issues with consent. The person isn't consenting to what they thought they were doing.
Oh, God. Yeah.
So, yeah, it's so problematic. Kitten fishing, I love the name of, is not that you make up an entirely different character, but you change significant aspects of who you are. So you might put yourself on a dating site and you might call yourself Liam, but you might be like a really, really wealthy investment banker instead of a lecturer.
Where does the connection to kitten fishing? Because kitten fishing makes me think that there's just guys with loads of photographs of people surrounded by kittens.
No. It's like catfishing is the grown-up version. Kitten fishing is like the baby version.
Okay.
So you're not changing everything. You're just changing bits.
I much prefer my definition.
Yeah, I know. I like your vision. I would totally fall for kitten fishing if it just involved having pictures of you with loads of kittens.
Yeah, I'm allergic to them. It's never going to happen. But no,
it'd be puppy fishing for you.
Puppy fishing, fun.
Woke fishing is pretty much as you might imagine it is. So this is where you might be attracted to someone, and so you say that your political identity is quite liberal and you're interested in women's rights and Black Lives Matter and various things like that. And it turns out that you actually aren't. At the worst, you might be like a Trump voter, but at best, you might just not care at all. And for someone who really is into those things, they generally want to be with someone who cares at least a bit about them and is interested in them. Mm-hmm. And so finding out your person, a significant part of what you liked about the person isn't actually true at all.
There's so much social psychology theory behind that. And there's not enough time, essentially.
There is not enough time.
You cannot, if someone really does not align to your moral values, you have to make a conscious decision as to whether you're going to put aside your own values for that person. Yes. And if you can't, the relationship isn't going to work.
Yeah.
And that's friendships. That's not necessarily romantic relationships. That's everything.
Yeah. And then hat fishing, which I talked about earlier. And there's other kinds of various fishing where you're basically just hiding or pretending that you're somehow different to yourself. So yeah, there is a bit of that, but it's not everybody. Just be careful that, particularly with catfishing, that if someone won't, at the very least, video chat you for a significant amount of time, or at best meet you fairly quickly, because catfishers obviously won't want to do that. Now with AI deepfakes, it's getting easier to create like a short video. It's not great yet, but it's getting easier. That's why like chatting back and forth for a significant amount of time is quite important. But preferably meeting in person to see that they are who they say they are is definitely important.
So I find catfishing really interesting. And it doesn't have to be this very elaborate detail or like kind of similar to like minor changes that we might make to deceive someone else. So I put out a post to ask people to tell me about some of their positive and negative stories. A guy came back to me to tell me about a potential catfish, or what he views to be catfishing. So he says, a girl that I met online, we were talking for about a week or two before we met on after we were chatting on Tinder. We met up, we went for a coffee and a walk, and she actually looked completely different to her profile. He says, and I was like obviously going to continue the date with her and everything, but yet it did not look like her at all in the photographs. And without sounding like an asshole, I was like, her body shape wasn't the same type that was being advertised online. So that's kind of a thing that I find women sometimes do.
Interesting. So that's like kitten fishing.
Yeah.
Slightly different to what you expected.
The language isn't great that he's used.
Yeah.
We'll sideline that. But like,
will we?
But just in terms of the focus on catfishing, like that's deceptive. Whatever the motivations for not having recent photographs, we've chatted about recent photographs on profiles and why that's important. I can like kind some of the older research,
there was a really good older research project that actually brought people into the research location. So they got them to submit their dating profile photos, and they looked at their profile, and then they got their passports to see what age they actually were. They took photos of them, they weighed them, they did a bunch of different things like that, and then they compared their dating profile to the actual information. And they found that women,
going to be the same.
Yeah, women were more likely to use older photographs.
Okay.
Men were more likely to say they were taller than they were. Particularly as they get closer to 6 feet, they're more likely to say they're 6 feet. Men who are actually 6 feet are less likely to lie about it. It's quite interesting. But the bell curve is almost exactly, I think, 2 inches taller across the whole curve.
I have no idea how tall I am, and I really don't care.
Well, apparently it matters. That's what guys say in their profiles all the time.
Yeah, sure.
I want to talk a minute about breaking up. Even though we're talking about online dating, people do some of this stuff, even if it's online dating, even if they aren't necessarily like dating the person yet. Breaking up in general increasingly happens over tech, right? Like so many people break up with each other over technology, or had somebody break up with them. Online disinhibition makes it a little bit easier. So the other person's invisible. You can't see them reacting. You don't have to deal with their emotions. They can't see you. So it's easier to say to them what you want to say, to maybe open up about your feelings if you're actually giving an explanation. But what's really common, and particularly in online dating, is ghosting. And this is cutting contact without any explanation whatsoever. Super common with both online and offline dating. Also with friendships, like in so many different places, people ghost each other. It's unbelievable.
So I have a really good ghosting story from a woman. She says, I went on a few dates with a guy just before the first COVID lockdown. Yeah, so thanks for bringing that memory up. He then stopped talking to me after a few days. And I remember we had been on a few dates early on. And after we'd gone on 1 or 2 dates, I actually called him out on it. And I told him that it made me feel really shit. And he eventually came back and apologized and said he wouldn't do it ever again. Then within maybe a week, he ghosted me completely and I never heard from him again. And he just completely cut off all contact as if I had never existed and we were planning on going on more dates. And that's what's interesting. I think it's the fact that I called him out on his shit and then he continued to do the exact same thing despite apologizing for it and acknowledging that it made me feel like crap.
Yeah, the reasons people do it, like it's an avoidance strategy. It's easy to do. It's very convenient to just not talk to somebody rather than just saying, hey, listen, I'm not so interested. But it's also about avoiding conflict. Some people are really bad at dealing with conflict. I'm total conflict avoidant.
But just send a message. Like you're behind a device. Like I wouldn't feel remotely bad about sending a message to someone and saying, sorry, it's not going to work.
Might.
Okay,
but yeah,
sorry.
In this particular case, it probably should. He probably doesn't want to be called out in it again. So that's probably it. Okay. It can be about avoiding conflict. It can also be about avoiding intimacy. It's also about knowing that you're like inflicting emotional distress, but with very little effort. So without having to specifically do it, you're doing it by not doing anything. But for some people, it's about safety, mainly women, right?
Okay, I get
so
that.
So a lot of guys react badly to being told no. And so a lot of women will ghost them rather than say anything at all. Because we have so many examples of women getting persistent contact after they've said no, getting harassed, getting abused, called names, threats, etc. after they've said no to somebody, that I very much understand why they would just pull out. So it could be fear of physical safety issues or just psychological
But no
safety.
one needs that grief anyway. No. But the ultimate disinhibition tool, which is the block feature on all of these apps.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
But despite all that, like that lack of closure is difficult. Even if the person didn't mean that much to you, you still wonder about it for a long time. It is difficult to understand why the contact was cut. And people often engage in a lot of self-criticism and like doubt and anxiety about what they did wrong and what's wrong with them.
But you heard that in that girl's post as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it doesn't feel great. But if it's any consolation, the ghoster can also feel anxiety, particularly about potentially meeting you somewhere in future. So they feel anxious about that. Not all of them, some of them don't, but some of them do. There's another term that I love that's related to ghosting. It's called zombieing. Have you heard of it before?
No.
I love all the terms that people have come up with. The name of this is particularly brilliant. So it's basically you have been ghosted, right? They're gone, dead. And then they come back from the dead, but they act like nothing happened. So it's been like 6 months. They left with no contact, didn't tell you why. And after 6 months, they're like, hey, girl, what's up?
Okay.
What you doing this weekend? Yeah.
Okay.
Very, very strange. And then breadcrumbing's a bit different. So that's quite manipulative. Basically, that's someone who's pretending they're interested in a relationship when they're not really. They're kind of keeping you hanging on. So there's very inconsistent contact, inconsistent responses. Your friend's ghosting story actually could fall under breadcrumbing if they had kept it going and kept doing that, where they disappear for a bit and then they come back and they're like, hey, but they're basically keeping you as an option on the side. They've got other things going on.
Or they're dating multiple people.
Totally. And that is one to avoid because they're stringing people along. So next episode, we're going to talk about all the bad stuff because this was all the good stuff, apparently. Yeah, so next time we're going to talk about more negative stuff like harassment and abuse and various other things. But this episode, we've tried to focus a little bit more on the positive stuff. There are some positives.
Like I thought that was really interesting.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Good.
It's interesting to see how you can kind of counteract some of the behaviours, spot some of the red flags, what actually makes a significant aspect, how we should communicate with each other, how to set up a correct profile. We have all of these kind of gems and what we need to do in terms of like specific profiles. I think all of that is really helpful. So that is positive.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be online dating unless we did talk about the negatives. So
I guess it's good to know you're not alone out there in like not finding it the most fun ever. Like we sort of talked about the less severe negative stuff this time, which is what most people's experience is. So tune in again next week for our second episode about all of the horrific stuff that we find in online dating. And I will give a pre-warning about the content stuff now. It will be quite negative. So look out for all the harassment, sexual harassment, mentions maybe of even suicide and things like that on that episode. It gets dark. But it is interesting, and I think it is useful to know that you're not the only one experiencing it if you have experienced it. I think that's kind of helpful sometimes, finding community through negative experiences.
Yeah, definitely.
So yeah, you will find us wherever you get your podcast next Tuesday. And you can also find us on social media. We are on Blue Sky and Instagram and YouTube and TikTok at In Bits Podcast. And we would love to hear your feedback. How are we doing? Are you enjoying it? What could we do differently? Please let us know. This episode was produced and edited by Owen Hurley. Thank you also to Owen for our fantastic music. And thank you all for listening.
See you next week, guys.